what I want to try and do today is sum up how far we've come. You remember what things were like at the beginning of the 16th century, when the Tudor period was beginning. England was a not particularly important country on the edge of Europe. And then by the time that Queen Elizabeth died, at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, it was much more on the map. Scotland and Ireland were much more under England's control, effectively, or they'd grown much closer together as countries. Scotland and Ireland still had their own parliaments, but the English had pushed their way into Ireland, and the Scottish had a Scottish king as King of England, bringing the two countries much closer together in that way. So what's happened now by the end of the 17th century? How is the shape of the country becoming much more like something we would recognize today? The Stuarts are not quite finished. James II has been kicked out, but his Protestant daughter has been invited back with her Dutch husband. So we've got James escaping to France and his daughter Mary ruling the country with her husband William of Orange. It says it's an area of what is now is that right? Southern France? William of Orange, Southern France? I thought he was Dutch. Whatever the heck. I mean, he was from somewhere in Europe, and he doesn't. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be a big issue here about the king anymore, quite so much the way they used to be, or the king or the queen, because it's now very clear. You have a contract. You've got a job to do. You don't have absolute power here. Parliament has demonstrated once and for all, if it doesn't like the king, it can chop his head off, and if it doesn't like him, it can just make him go away. So it's done it twice now, and it's demonstrated that, hey, look, you're a king, but you can be a king under our conditions, leading to what we have today. We have what's called a constitutional monarchy. If a new law is made today by Parliament, it goes through various stages. The final stage is the Queen has to sign it. And she always signs it. She's never not signed it. If she did not sign it, then they would have to have a general election. The result of the general election could be the people agree with what she wouldn't sign. They wanted her to sign it, and that would probably lead to the end of the monarchy. No more kings and queens. The government would say, look, we only ask you to do one little thing. That's to sign our laws. And you wouldn't do it. And the people have voted. They showed that they wanted you to do that. So I think we need to get rid of the monarchy. Okay? That's the probable outcome. There are constitutional issues that might arise because the army swears its obedience, its allegiance to the king or queen, not to the government or the parliament of the day. Okay? Which is a very important point, because if the army was under the control of the political party, okay, again, you've got the army, the prime minister can say, right, bring in the army and let's declare war on Birmingham, or let's declare war on any rebellious part of the country that we don't like. We can make war on, right? And in order for that not to happen, and never to happen, the army declares its allegiance to the Queen, or the king, if it's a king. So there would be problems, because the army might step up and say, hey, the government's telling the Queen that she doesn't have a job anymore, and we are with the Queen. Okay, now we've got to fight it. It could lead to another civil war, in theory. But in practice, what would probably happen would be that the Queen would say, okay, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody now, or else I'm going to sign it after all. I doubt that there would be a war over it. But yeah, it's part of this balance of power that's grown up. So Mary and William are now running the country, but more and more it's the government, it's the Parliament that is making the big decisions. From 1689, Mary died, and notice that this means that William is no longer king. It's her sister now that becomes queen. And again, she's going to die childless. So, yeah, just look at that. She had 5 stillborn children, 5 children who died at an early age, and 7 miscarriages. That's 17. She was pregnant 17 times and did not produce a single surviving child. I think that in itself gives you an understanding of what life was like still in those days. Okay? All right? You just can't imagine that happening today. All right? Medicine has moved on. And that's part of changes in medicine and so on are part of what changes lead to the changes in the society as well. But there you go. That's the simple fact is that there are no more Stuarts left, except that branch of the family that got kicked out during the Glorious Revolution. So that's the end of the Stuart line. And from that time onwards, there were several attempts to bring back the Catholic Stuarts, to bring back James II's son, James, the old pretender, and then later on his grandson, Charles, the young pretender. And these are called the Jacobite risings. The people who supported the Catholic Stuarts were known as Jacobites because Jacobus is the Latin name for James. So they supported basically James, then his son, the old pretender, and then his grandson, the young pretender. They still call them Jacobites even though his name was Charles, because they just got that name. So that all failed, and basically that was the end of a dream. And there are many sentimental Scottish songs which maybe, I don't know, I've never lived in Scotland or anything, but I get this image of Scottish people sort of late at night in the pub, perhaps get a bit, having drunk one too many whiskey, getting together and singing some of those sentimental songs about James and Charles and how they never were able to come back. Songs about Bonnie Prince Charlie and so on that sentimentalize this whole conflict of the Scots and their attempt to have a Scottish king on the English throne. And then after Anne's death, the nearest relative was the King of Hanover in Germany. And if you remember, it gets so complicated, I can't remember myself. But, James had, on his mother's side, had a great grandson, and that was George, okay, because of the marriage that had happened to some yes, you remember the 30 Years' War, all of that. Remember when I can't remember her name now. She married Frederick, and Frederick got kicked off the. You look at your notes and you'll find it. It's is it Elizabeth Stuart? I think possibly it's Elizabeth Stuart marrying Fred. It's all so complicated. Anyway, the point is that this guy is the great grandson of that marriage that happened with a Stuart princess marrying a European prince, and he was king for a while, and then it was Elizabeth, Now he's the elected Palatine. He becomes king for a while, but then he gets kicked out as king, and the 30 Years' War starts, and lots and lots of people die, but he goes on with this Elizabeth, and she has children, and the great-grandson is the nearest relative. So just as the Stuart James I was the closest relative when the Tudor line died out because Elizabeth had no children, the closest relative was from the time of Henry VIII when his sister married the Scottish king. So in the same way, the closest relative now is this European George, who's the great-grandson of Elizabeth, the Stuart, Stuart, well, she's not a princess, but she's not in line for the throne, but she's the daughter of the king, and she marries this European Frederick, and it ends up with George being the closest relative. But it doesn't matter, none of it really matters very much, because like George is the King of England, he doesn't speak English. He doesn't speak English, he speaks German. He's not even interested in England. Okay, so the beginning of the 18th century, you get a completely different mood coming in. You've got a king who's not really interested in the country at all, doesn't speak the language, and guess what's going to happen? The politicians will fill the gap, as they have ever since. Okay? It's the politicians now. They start having prime ministers, which they didn't have before, and they start to create this situation where the king or queen is just a figurehead, just a sort of symbolic thing, and the real power is with the parliament. So the 18th century moves into that kind of situation. So, yeah, the first thing is that the Glorious Revolution, as I said when we were talking just now, was that there was a definite limit to the power of kings, and they had to obey their contract, or else they were going to get into trouble with the parliament. But when George comes along, it goes one step further, because he's not really interested in the country, doesn't speak the language, and so Parliament extends its power, and the 18th century becomes a time of parliamentary power being stronger and stronger. Not necessarily any better than what England had seen under its kings and queens, but certainly stronger. So it's the Parliament that's calling the shots these days. So let's take a look now at the international connections. Now, way back, Wales had been under the control of England. So often when they said England, they just, it's kind of atarimai. Wales is kind of included. So they didn't even mention Wales. If you look at the Union Jack, the flag that we use now, Ireland is in it, okay, with the flag of St. Patrick. Scotland is in it with the flag of St. Andrew, and England is in it with the flag of St. George, but Wales is not even in it. Okay, there's no part of the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom, there's no part of that flag that represents Wales. It's assumed to be together with England. And yeah, the fact that the Tudors were a Welsh family made it easier for Wales to be kind of put together, joined together with England. And then with Scotland, it's exactly the same, because the Stuart monarchs are of Scottish origin, and that brings those two countries together after hundreds of years of Scotland being closer to France, all that kind of Braveheart stuff, Braveheart being a totally non-historical movie, but there's a germ of truth there. That essentially Scotland was coming under English control more and more at that time in the Middle Ages, and under Robert the Bruce, really, rather than William Wallace failed. He's the hero of Braveheart, and he in the end failed, but Robert the Bruce carried on and did what William Wallace couldn't, and pushed the English out. And from then on, for a long time, Scotland was closer to France than to England. But this, of course, brought them together. And the other thing that had brought them together, if you remember, was religion. Scotland was, although they had a slightly different form of Protestantism, remember those Presbyterian versus Episcopalian, okay, that stuff, whether they wanted a system with bishops or not, the Scottish didn't. But they were still the same kind of, they were still basically Protestants, which helped to bring them together. So, Wales and Scotland are kind of naturally being drawn into a close relationship with England. Wales is already considered to be united with England. Scotland doesn't formally become united until the beginning of the 18th century, 1707. And then, after the Act of Union with Scotland, Scotland and Wales became the Kingdom of Great Britain. And so, if I was teaching the 18th century, I would be talking about Britain, I would be talking about the United Kingdom. I've been talking about England most of the time because it has not been formally united with the other parts of Britain. So that's something that's changing. It's not so much England anymore, it's more a question of Britain. And Ireland, again, another 100 years before Ireland formally and legally becomes part of that United Kingdom. But for most of this period, Ireland has been kept strictly under control by England. They've kind of bullied their way and pushed their way and forced their way into Ireland. There's been very little humanity or kindness shown. The Irish have been regarded as little better than animals, and on top of that, they are Catholic. So there's that alienation from the point of view of religion. So Ireland's relationship with England was always much more difficult than that of Wales or Scotland. And our friend Oliver Cromwell comes back into the picture here because he was particularly cruel in his suppression of the Irish. From the kind of Middle Ages, 12th, 13th century onwards, the English had been pushing into Ireland from time to time. And we saw that sometimes they controlled a bigger area, very roughly. Sometimes they controlled more. Sometimes they controlled less. Dublin is here. They always controlled at least a small area around Dublin, known as the Pale. But sometimes they controlled much bigger. They were being pushed. They pushed forwards and they were being pushed back all through that period. And it's quite a complicated story, but in many ways, rather than like England's relationship with Scotland, which was not about English people going to live in Scotland or anything, it was simply about a political connection between the two countries. In many ways, Ireland was the first colony, first Chocomici, because this was all about English people going and setting up farms and owning land inside Ireland. It was the first colony. So the relationship has always been that of kind of imperial nation to colonized. So that's very different from the relationship with Wales and Scotland, which was all about political union, not about going and colonizing those areas. And for God's sake, I mean, nobody. Scotland's beautiful. And nobody in their right minds would want to go and live there. Seriously, no, that's pushing it, okay? I don't quite mean it like that. What I mean to say is that if you were English, you had the best farmland, anyway. Scotland is full of rugged mountains, and they can't even grow wheat. They had to make porridge out of oats, which in England was used as horse food. The English would not go to live in Scotland because the conditions were far worse. And when a Scottish king came to England, what did he do? Oh, this is great. Oh, wow. oh, you know, they can have this stuff. Wow, let me have it. Oh yeah, they will love luxury, you know, feather beds and everything. And he got the country he got himself into personal debt, and he got the country into debt. Okay, within a very short time of becoming king of England. So when King James came down, this is the good life. Okay, so even kings did not live a life of luxury in Scotland at that time. So it wasn't a question of people wanting to go and live in Scotland, but Ireland was. It was a question of colonising Ireland for political reasons, really. Get English Protestants, or Scottish ones, to go to Ireland, and once they're there, they help us to control the Catholic people if they don't get killed in the meantime, which periodically would happen. The Irish would rise up and they'd kill these new settlers. So, yeah, I talked a little bit about this on the web page. After the Glorious Revolution, James went to France, then he went into Ireland, and he got support from the Irish Catholics to try to win back his crown, but that didn't work. And William fought a war against the Jacobites, again helping to extend English control in Ireland. And then by the end of this war, known as the Williamite War, the Jacobite movement in Ireland was crushed. And this is one big reason why the Irish, it's not just that they lost and James ran away, but they lost, and many, many punitive measures were introduced against the Irish as a result of losing that war. You supported James to be king. James has run away, and we're going to punish you. Okay, the Catholic Irish are going to go through a horrible time here. Ireland is going to be dominated by Protestants, and the Catholics, the original Irish inhabitants, are being reduced to the status of second-class citizens. And this is pretty big stuff. So let's take a look at what happens in Ireland. This policy of encouraging British Protestants to settle in Ireland goes right back to the beginning of the Reformation. It goes back to Henry VIII, even, in a limited form. And some of those people will be English. As time went by, and Scotland became a Protestant country too, it became more and more a thing for the English. Look, if you think about it, the English government is down here, this is Wales, this is Ireland. It's a terribly bad map, I know. London is down here, the government is down here. How do we control these wild Catholic people? Well, let's get Protestants to go over there and kind of help us to keep them under control. Let's give them incentives. Let's tell them that if they go, we'll give them support, we'll give them land, and so on. And what better than sending these particular Protestants over? I mean, they're pretty wild too. They're a long way from us. And what do we care whether they're, up in Scotland eating their porridge, or whether they go over here to eat their porridge? Okay. So we'll send them over there. Now my map is out of scale, so it should be a smaller island at this stage. All right. So most of them are coming from Scotland, so they go to this area in the north of Ireland, and of course that leads to a big situation today, something that's affecting Brexit. How does this area leave Europe while this area stays inside Europe? What do we do? What do we do on this border? Okay, that's a problem for today's politicians, and that problem has its origins in this policy of sending Protestants over to Ireland, and the way it developed, particularly under Cromwell, that many of them came from Scotland. So that they settled in the north of Ireland. Why did they settle in the north of Ireland like that? Lots of them. Suppose one of them, or a little family, or a few people, had said, let's go right down here. And what do you think is going to happen? What are the local people going to say? Oh, great, we're so happy to see you. You come here to control us. Oh, that's wonderful. And the English have said you can have land here. They're giving you land, they're giving you bits of our land to come here. What a pleasure it is to have you here. Well, no. They would be isolated, they would be outnumbered, and they would be killed. Probably. Unless they quickly said, no, we don't want any of that. We're happy to live wherever you want us to live, and we'll just keep our mouths shut. But if they went in with that attitude of colonizing in small numbers like that, they were much more likely to get killed. So they stayed for their own protection in those days, in the northern area. And that's why in that area today, there are something like 60% Protestants to 40% Catholics. And that's why when Ireland became independent, they said, no, we don't want to be independent. Okay? We came from here, we are still culturally, so the majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted to carry on being part of Britain and part of the United Kingdom. In fact, just over 100 years ago, when the question was coming up, seriously for the first time, these Protestants of Scottish descent in Northern Ireland were saying, if you make us independent, we'll fight you. We'll make war on you. All right? Which I think I mentioned that before, and I think it's a unique situation. Have you ever had people saying, we will fight you not to be independent? I mean, countries fight for their independence, right? Northern Ireland, I think, is the only case in history of a country that was saying, if you try to make us independent, we'll fight you. It didn't happen because World War I came along and things moved in a different direction. But that's what they were saying at the time. And all of that has its roots in this period that we've been talking about. So the Catholics became more and more under the control of the Protestant settlers. And, for example, all through the 17th century, you can see things happening. For example, in 1607, they weren't allowed to hold public office. They weren't allowed to serve in the army. It goes on. They have to attend Church of England services. But we're Catholic. We don't care. You have to come to the Church of England church. Okay? So they're being forced into a culture that they don't want, and they're being denied positions of power in their own country. They were still allowed to be members of the House of Commons, members of Parliament, but in 1652, even that power was taken away from them. And this is all before the big push against them that's going to happen as a result of losing this war, the Williamite War, losing this war where they supported James. That's when it's going to get really tough. So this is all before it starts to get really tough. Many of the laws were repealed during the Restoration, so there was a period there when things were easier for them. But then after that war against William, that war for James to become king again, things went completely the other direction, and Ireland had a very, very, very bad time. Can't marry Protestants. I want to... Oh, well. Sorry, I'm going to take that back. Sorry, there's supposed to be a lovely, rude sound that comes out each time the bubbles come up, but I
got the sun setting. It's wrong, and I can't change it now. So you just have to live without them. Here we go. Same. Sound's not coming from the speakers. It's just coming out. Anyway, so Catholics are not allowed to buy a horse. They're not allowed to have a horse. They're not allowed to marry Protestants. They're not allowed to vote. They can't teach. They can't inherit land. They can't convert to Protestant to Catholic. Protestants can't convert to Catholicism. Catholics are not allowed to go and get an education in another country. They're not allowed to practice law. They can't own guns. They can't buy land. Okay, they are being treated essentially as second-class citizens, or even you could say that they're being treated like animals. Okay, so that you get. Jonathan Swift, who you may recognize him as the author of Gulliver's Travels. You know Gulliver's Travels, yeah? Gulliver's Travels is not just a story for children. It was a political satire. All of those things that happen in Gulliver's Travels, they have a political meaning. And he's very famous, as well as Gulliver's Travels, he's very famous for a short speech in Parliament called A Modest Proposal. And he builds it up very slowly. He talks about the terrible conditions in Ireland, because he grew up in Ireland. He was an English Protestant growing up in Ireland, but he hated what he saw. And so he said, look, in Ireland, the terrible conditions, children are born in Ireland. They're going to grow up, and they're not going to have any chance to make a living, so they're going to end up stealing, they're going to end up begging on the streets. It's a terrible problem, and I've got a proposal. I've got a recommendation to solve that problem. Eat them. Eat the kids when they're about 3 years old. Of course it's ironic, of course it's satirical. What he's saying is, you've done everything else to these people. You haven't actually eaten their kids yet, but you've done everything else. Why don't you just take the final step and eat their kids? I mean, come on, you're crying out loud, you're mistreating them in every possible way. Okay, and they didn't listen then. 100 years later, Ireland suffers in the 19th century. It suffers the potato famine. Millions of people die because by this time, the potato is more or less the only food that Irish people are able to eat, that they can get. It's all they can afford. They live on potatoes. They have, just like in Japan, you talk about asa gohan, hiru gohan and ban gohan. Well, it was asa imo, imo and ban imo. Okay, they had potatoes. The Irish have something like 50 or 60 different ways of cooking potatoes. If you want to know about how to treat potatoes in the kitchen, ask an Irish person. They will know, even today. All right? The potato famine, because the potato crop failed, and the English government, the British government, did nothing. And millions of people died. The population of Ireland today is still less than it was before the potato famine. Okay? The population has never fully recovered. Wherever you go in the world, you'll find Irish people. Okay? They went to America in large numbers. You'll find them everywhere around the world. It's not a country for young people. They get out because the job opportunities are poor and so on. So, again, all of this maltreatment of the Irish, which has continued, still has its effects today. It has its beginnings in our period. So these laws lasted from 1691 to 1801, and that was called the Protestant Ascendancy. If you were a Protestant in Ireland, you had all the privileges. If you were a Catholic, you had none. And,
tens or even hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics were shipped to America and the Caribbean as laborers. There's some kind of, is it a debate or something? They weren't slaves, but there are some websites where they'll say they were slaves. They weren't exactly slaves, but they weren't in a much better position, frankly, than slaves. So, along with the black slavery from Africa, the Irish were sent as cheap labor to the Americas in large numbers. Some went voluntarily, especially in the 19th century, when Ireland was so poor. Some just chose to go to America, but others had very little choice about what they did. They were just sort of being shipped off. We need laborers. Come on, let's go and take you to work over there. And even after England and Ireland were united in the United Kingdom in 1801, there still continued to be discrimination. So I'm looking ahead from our period, but we've got a big problem with Ireland. When we think about the British Empire, we would have to say Ireland was the first and the worst. Okay, the English made all their mistakes in Ireland. Okay, so I think it's important to know that. Now, if you remember, I talked about the British Commonwealth a bit. Was it last week or the week before? Anyway, I mentioned it a couple of times now. And it was an organization, well, it still is. It's an organization of over 50 countries that used to be part of the British Empire. It's something that here in Japan people don't know much about because you were never part of the British Empire. So the British Commonwealth doesn't really kind of hit your consciousness in the same way. But most of the countries that were part of the British Empire wanted to keep some kind of contact. It's like when the British Empire, as we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but why did the British Empire get started? Money. Money. It was all about money. It was all about markets. It was all about trading. Okay? And then after World War II, who hasn't got any money? Britain. Britain didn't finish paying America for money that it borrowed from America to help it fight that war until quite recently. And after World War II, Britain was very poor. So Britain could no longer maintain this empire. So they said, wherever the country might be, many parts of Africa, India, various places, they sort of said, I think this is it. I mean, hey guys, you wanted your country back. You didn't want us here really very much in the first place, and we're going. Okay? Bye-bye. It's your country now. But we're still friends, right? I mean, when we sell stuff, you'll still buy, and when we need cheap labor, you'll still come to our country and drive our trains and sweep our streets and so on. We're still friends, yeah. And that's the way they've been very diplomatic here, British. Can't imagine, for example, in Japan's case with Korea, having that kind of relationship. All right? It's still quite touchy, especially for older Korean people. 100 years later, or many years later. Britain very cleverly kept this kind of relationship with these countries. Some of them continued to have British passports for quite a long time. Some of them even today, I think I said this before, some of them have the British flag. Some of them use the Queen as their symbolic leader. So there's still quite a strong relationship there, but which country is not part of the Commonwealth? Ireland. Ireland said, you're making us independent, well, goodbye. But we're still friends, aren't we? Goodbye. Okay? Actually, there is still a very close relationship between the two countries, but they're not part of the Commonwealth. They wanted to make it clear that they did not want to have any kind of relationship after their experiences. Okay? So that's Ireland. there were plenty of wars going on in this later part of the 17th century and during the 18th century. Several wars against Holland, for example. And as I said, this was all about the empire. Holland was a big, competitor for controlling Shokuninshi, for controlling colonies around the world. Holland was, many European, Spain was in on the game, France was in on the game, many countries were in on, trying to get hold of colonies. But why did they want them? Like I say, they wanted them because of the developing markets. It was all built on trade. It was all premised on trade. And initially, Holland was in the lead for quite a long time. Holland was the main colonizing nation, and England was taking second position. And then, during the middle of the 18th century, England starts fighting against France. Holland starts to lose its control. And by 1753, fighting against France in particular, but against other European nations, fighting for control of colonies, fighting for trading routes. This, in the middle of the 18th century, this is when Britain finally becomes an empire. We talk about the British Empire. By 1753, Britain, I should say Britain really, it's not just England, because it's the United Kingdom now. Britain had basically beaten other European nations into the first place, and it was the controlling empire. It controlled a huge empire. Many parts of India, for example, were French before they were British. Okay? Many of those parts of the Caribbean, again, they were Spanish or Portuguese, or they belonged to other powers, and then they became British later on. So Britain took over from other colonizing European nations and won possession of large areas of the planet. Looking at it in terms of the map, we saw how at the beginning of the Tudor period, England controlled Wales. It controlled a small part of Ireland, this part that we call the Pale, okay, which would grow and shrink periodically. It was, as we pointed out at the beginning of the course, a fairly unimportant country on the edge of Europe. Okay, you've got it there. All right. So, things really have changed in 200 years, and by 1660, by the middle of the 17th century, England's got effective control over Scotland and Ireland. It is still not politically united, but basically it's all under English control. And it's also got colonies in Africa, India, the Americas. Look how it's spread itself out in 150 years or so. Look how it's established colonies around the world. Mostly for trading purposes, for markets, goods like tobacco, cotton, spices. I mean, even the potato didn't exist in England in the time of Henry VIII or something. Having a cup of tea. I mean, how English can you be? Well, as we said, even Shakespeare probably never did that. So, if you move on now to 100 years ahead, it doesn't seem to have changed all that much. All right, it's still, more parts of India than before, if you compare it. All right, it goes from there to there. more parts of India, the parts of America slightly grown. It's all grown up a little bit, but what that map doesn't show you is the development of infrastructure. Okay, these are now settled communities with big trading operations going on. So although in terms of land, it's not changed a huge amount in 100 years, in terms of influence, it's changed a lot. And the other thing that you don't see on this map very easily is little islands scattered around the place, especially here in the Caribbean. Okay. Controlling these little islands around the world was a very, very important thing because that's how transport happened, by ship. Okay? All of those bananas, they would come from the Caribbean by ship. All of the tobacco, the cotton, all of these materials, most of it was traveling by ship. So controlling the sea was very important. British ships can stop at all these little island places to get fresh water, to get supplies, because these are controlled by the British. So one of the most famous songs about the British Empire was "Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves." It's an empire that's controlled by having little islands all over the sea. It's a sea-going empire. And although its territory is not so huge in 1754, it's become strategically very important. And what's going to happen is this. Hello? Hey, come on. What's my word? It's not word. It to be. Okay, yeah. By the early 20th century, half the world is the British Empire. It's extended its control over Africa. It lost, notice, it lost the United States in the 18th century. But it's covered this huge area of the planet by the beginning of the 20th century. And today, it's gone back more or less to where it was at the beginning of the Tudor period. Not quite, because you can still see things like this. Margaret Thatcher fought a war about the Falkland Islands, okay, 30 years ago or so. And there are still little islands scattered around the Pacific and the Atlantic that are British, okay? So, you know, it still has some, right on the other side of the world, it's still got some possessions. But essentially that empire just disappeared. And as I say, it began mostly for economic reasons, and it ended mostly for economic reasons. So the wheel's gone almost full circle. Most of Ireland is independent now. All right? It's only this little corner in the north of Ireland that's still part of the United Kingdom. Most of Ireland's independent. Scotland had a referendum 3 or 4 years ago, and it was quite narrow. They were almost saying we'll leave. And now with Brexit, I think there's another chance that they'll try again. This time they'll say, yes, we're going. We're Europeans, even if you don't want to be. The traditional relationship between Scotland and France, or Scotland and Europe, I think it's still pretty strong. So if England wants out, England will get out, but it may mean the breakup of the United Kingdom. So, as I say, there are a few remote islands and territories that are in British possession. You can see them marked on the map there. There's Gibraltar in the south of Spain. There's all these little places around that are still British. But there's the Commonwealth. All right, now if you look at the Commonwealth, you can see that these are many of the countries that were also in the empire. Okay, Empire, Commonwealth. Empire, Commonwealth. So many of those countries continued to have a relationship with Britain. As I say, I think there are 53 at the moment, and they don't call it the British Commonwealth anymore, they call it the Commonwealth of Nations, meaning that they have a strong relationship with each other, not just with Britain. So Britain is not central to the Commonwealth of Nations anymore. It sees itself as a community of nations that have a strong relationship. So that's part of our Tudor and Stuart period is when all of this is getting going. It's all getting started. Okay? So the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire. Right. As I've been saying, we're looking at something that's much closer to a society that we can recognize, much closer to our world. And a lot of that is to do with religion and the fact that at the beginning of the 17th century it would be normal to think that your life was just a prelude to eternal life in heaven or in hell. I'm not saying that everybody thought like this. And Shakespeare, in one of his plays, one character says to a Puritan, "Because thou art virtuous, shall there be no more cakes and ale? Just because you're a good guy, can't we have fun?" So I mean, obviously that's a way of thinking that's universal and it's been around for a very long time. But the balance of society was towards those people who saw life in religious terms at the beginning of the 17th century. So this world is just a place where we've talked about the suffering aspect, and we suffer in order to gain entrance to heaven after death. Now the effect of the Puritan period probably was to push the society in the opposite direction. Thank you, you Puritan guys. Thank you. We know what you're talking about. You've shown us what you're talking about. We've experienced what you're talking about, and we don't want it. Okay? Those of you who went off to America in your boats, thank God you've gone. Because we don't want that here. We don't want that kind of Puritan society in England. We're more liberal than that. And today, again, you'll see a difference, I think, in religious feeling in America. If you're not religious in America, there's no way that you're going to be the president. Okay, you've got to talk about God and everything. We don't even think about that from our prime minister or even any of our politicians. It's just not an issue, whether they're Christians or not. Just don't think about it. America is much more religiously conservative than Britain, and I think part of that was a reaction against the Puritans because of what it was like under Oliver Cromwell. And so what you get then is the broader acceptance of the pleasure principle, that yeah, cakes and ale are not so bloody bad. Okay, let's have some fun. And having Charles II as king, I said, kings just want to have fun last week. Well, that's part of it. Having a pleasure-loving king helped to move the society in that direction. And all sorts of things were changing. Belief in witchcraft was declining. Science and philosophy were developing. The idea that ordinary people have rights, that was beginning to take root. You see, in the old way of thinking, you don't have any rights. If you suffer in this world, well, you suffer. But you can go to heaven afterwards. So it doesn't really matter. It was all your suffering was just a preparation for going to heaven. Or if you're a bad guy, all your suffering was just preparation for going to hell. Neither way does it really matter. Neither way is there a sense that you as a human being have a right not to have to undergo certain experiences or certain forms of suffering. So these ideas are beginning to change. we get a landmark piece of legislation passed in 1689 called the Bill of Rights. And nobody had ever really made a law about human rights before. This is one of the ways, I think there are lots of ways in which Britain has led the world. It led the world not necessarily in a good way, but it's going to go on to have the first industrial revolution. It's got so many things where did it first happen? It first happened in Britain. And the idea of legislation for rights, that's one really big, important thing that happened, and it happened in Britain. So it said that you have to have you can't close down Parliament just because you don't like it. You can't make taxes. Only Parliament can make taxes. Parliament can say what it wants. It has free speech. You can't suspend laws without the agreement of Parliament. So a lot of this is limiting the powers of the king. You have to have free elections. You can't have cruel and unusual punishments. You can't have armies in peacetime. And Protestants are allowed to carry weapons. These sorts of things were included in the Bill of Rights. Cruel and unusual punishments is an interesting one because that phrase comes up quite frequently in later bills and laws. And this landmark piece of legislation has gone on to have its effect on the development of democratic societies all around the world, really, because you got the fundamental laws of England. You've got the American Declaration of Independence, which echoes a lot of this legislation. You've got the American Bill of Rights, which kind of is based to a large extent on this one. You've got the French Declaration of the Rights of Man at the time of the French Revolution. You've got the United Nations, Kokureng, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of these later pieces of legislation, okay, the French Declaration of the Human Rights of Man after the Revolution. So all of these bits of legislation, they all go back to the kind of granddaddy of them all, which was this Bill of Rights passed in 1689 in Britain, or in England, as it still was in 1689 in England. So it's a landmark to turn the whole world in the end, or many parts of the world, into the direction of, well, humans have rights, and people have a right not to be treated in certain kinds of ways. Society is developing. Again, it's the first country in the world to have more, the first reasonably sized country in the world to have more people living in the cities than in the countryside. It's the first major urban society. We get the first newspaper, we talked about that, that came out in 1620, so people could sit and read a newspaper, which is something people still do today. And although actually printing was strictly controlled, so it was published in Holland and shipped to England, but then you get, a few years later, in 1650, you get the first coffee shop. So from 1650 onwards, an English person can go into a coffee shop, open up a newspaper, smoke a cigarette or a pipe, read a newspaper. William Shakespeare could never do any of those. Well, he could have smoked, all right, tobacco, but that kind of coffee shop lifestyle, the coffee shop identity, didn't exist, you see, in Shakespeare's time. And it's such
became such a basic part of society. Much more in a way than it is today. Because today, a coffee shop is just a coffee shop. But in those days, the coffee shops were so much more than just coffee shops. Let's take a look at that. The newspapers would be read in the coffee shops, and the customers would talk about what was in the newspaper. Have you seen this latest thing that Oliver Cromwell's doing? You know, they would be able to talk about it in the coffee shops. The control of print became more relaxed, so large numbers of newspapers were able to be published, and different political views would be expressed. Opposite sides of the political debate would be expressed. So you're getting a sort of democratic flow of information. And the Civil War was not just a war that happened, you know, with guns and fighting. It was a war of debate. It was a war of discussion. And the coffee shops would be one of the sort of central places where that discussion would be taking place. So remember how I showed you how did information get passed around in the time of the Stuarts? They'd stand out in that big public square next to the church, and they'd speak it out, and then they'd sort of spread it around. Now, it's happening in little coffee shops around the place. Right? And of course, one group in one coffee shop might be talking about it in one way, and another group in another coffee shop will be developing a different way of thinking. So you've got it, it's all sort of spreading out in different directions, and discussion of things. Ideas are spreading rapidly. So you got a Crown newspaper, the London Gazette. You got all kinds of different political views being expressed. By 1700, you've got about 3,000 coffee shops just in London, and dozens of newspapers, most of which come out several times a week. So you've got a very, very different setup. When we go back to Queen Elizabeth's time, there were no newspapers, and somebody would stand up in the square, and they also used to have people who walked around the town with a bell, called the town crier. That would be how they would spread more immediate pieces of news, like, terrible murder in Hammersmith, terrible murder in Hammersmith, 3 children burnt to death in their beds, you know, whatever it might be, okay? So they go around the town shouting out the news. But that doesn't leave very much possibility for discussion. It's just one person shouting things out. We've now got a situation where people can sit down and talk about all of these things. And we've got newspapers, daily news. The first daily newspaper comes out early in the 18th century. So we're starting to see something that's more like our kind of society. And some of the famous coffee houses are Lloyd's. Now, Lloyd's is still a major banking concern. So what happens is people go in there and they start talking about this. I've got an idea. And what's your idea? Well, you know those ships that travel abroad? It's a huge risk. All right? People pay huge amounts of money, and then the ship sinks. But most of the time it comes back okay. Suppose we collected from everybody, like, say, £100. And then the one person whose ship sinks, we'll pay them 1,000 to compensate them. Wouldn't that be a good idea? All right? And of course, we've collected from 20 people, so we've got £2,000. We made £1,000 profit. Unless we're very unlucky and more ships sink than we expect. Okay? But over the long term, we'll calculate it so that we'll always be pulling in more than we pay out. All right? So, Lloyd's. Okay? And it starts from a coffee shop. All right? Jonathan's was another coffee shop. It's not the Jonathans you see here in Japan all the time.
But this was the start of the Kabul, the stock exchange. The whole banking system developed basically through these coffee shops. People getting together and thinking, hey, we could do it like this. We could set up this kind of system. All right. So it is having a huge effect on shaping the world that we know today. Bateson's Batson's was a doctor's surgery, okay, and the whole medical system that we have today. I'm not going to say that the whole of it goes back to the coffee shops, but it played an important part in getting medical experts sitting down together, saying, "Wait a minute, you're wrong about that. There's been some research done, you know," and starting to share and specialize in medicine. The Grecian coffee shop was a place where scientists would get together. Writers would go to Will's, so the publishing houses would know, let's go down to Will's and see if there's any new talent that we could publish, or So you've got all of these organisations that are setting up, all right? So specialisms are not just people working on their, doing their own research into medicine or something. They've got a community that's growing up, and so the economic and the social structures, the hospitals and so on, they're all getting a big boost at this time. Science is getting a big boost. Things are kind of pushing forward, and part of it is this kind of coffee shop society. That's not all of it, because they start to build big hospitals as well at this time. They start to develop research laboratories and things, but it's all getting a big boost from a change in society that's moved away from life is all about going to church. It's definitely moving away from that. So this is a typical kind of coffee shop from that period. You can see all these, all men, by the way, all men, all sitting around. I don't know which particular coffee shop this is actually, but you can see how you get all these. You look at the way they wear these wigs were worn by the upper class. Okay, it's a sort of symbolic thing. It gives them status. It's part of this very ornate fashion. These are rich people, influential people, powerful people, and they're getting together and they're talking about things. And nobody can really stop this. Society is moving in a different direction. Just as the king can no longer keep control of a country and say, chop his head off, chop his head off. Instead, the people turn around and say, I think we'd rather chop yours off. Okay? In the same kind of way, nobody can control this sort of spread of this kind of coffee shop society, which is really changing the face of the country. So you get Christie's and Sotheby's, Twinings, Fortnum and Mason. A lot of the big companies that we still have today have their origins in this late 17th century, early 18th century. Now, Japan has, I think, most of the really, really, really ancient companies in the world are Japanese. More than 1,000 years old. But they are very small. They are nearly all of them very small family businesses, where father passes it on to son, who passes it on to son, who passes it on to son, through many, many generations. And it's still, you can still go to Himeji and find the people whose great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents made the samurai swords. You can still see these things around. But they are small family businesses. And they're much, much older than these companies. But this is the beginning of the big company. Okay, the multinational. Okay, these things, they're working together with like the East India Company, which had its own army. Okay, the colonization of India was done through a private company with its own private army. Okay, that's how powerful these businesses were. And the East India Company was actually set up initially by Queen Elizabeth at the beginning of the 17th century. So you've got these kind of big, important companies, many of which are still surviving today. science and technology, which is going to change the world forever. England at this stage leads the world in astronomy, in exploring the stars and calculating the hugeness of the universe. When you look at the Middle Ages, when they drew a map of the universe, they drew a map of the universe like this. Earth, moon, sun, planets, stars. Okay, something like that, okay? It's geocentric, the Earth is in the middle. The more that they realized that, no, at the very least you should be putting the sun in the middle, because the sun doesn't go around the Earth goes around the sun, and the sun is much bigger than the Earth. Okay, that decentralizes humans. And the idea that, God made it all like this with us in the middle. No, we're beginning to realize how tiny we are, how huge the universe is. And England, again, is leading the field in astronomy. And this is beginning with Francis Bacon in the 16th century. Okay, he's a kind of father of scientific thought. A 16th century contemporary with Shakespeare. Is it that late? Oh, sugar puffs. I thought I had a bit more time. Sorry, I shouldn't have given you that couple of minutes break. Look, I'll finish this off next week, okay? But I think you're getting the picture of how very different the world is now at the beginning of the 18th century. So yes, I'm sorry I couldn't quite finish off. And we'll see the rest of the story next week.